Hello, I'm Nick Ross for iTWire. Today I'm with Chris Fisher, who's the Director of Security Engineering APJ at Vectra AI. Chris, who are you and what is your role?
Hi, Nick. So my name is Chris Fisher, Director of Security Engineering here at Vectra AI. I lead the team up across Asia, Pacific, and Japan, and we closely engage with our customers just to make sure that they're getting the best out of our solution and also understanding the problems that they're facing and how we can help them solve them.
So how did Vectra AI first come about and what would companies want to work with you for?
Yeah, Vectra's a leader in AI threat detection and response, and it really came about when we looked at the challenges that customers were facing. Most people don't realize Vectra's actually been around now since for about 10 years. And it all started with this idea of that if we think of traditional tools and the challenges that customers were facing, it was all around noise and just how long it was taking to investigate. And we really looked at how can we use AI to help cut through that noise and deliver signal clarity to our end customers. And that's really where it all started. And then obviously as the network landscape evolved into cloud and multi-cloud and hybrid, we started to pivot and look at different areas to be able to provide that threat detection. When we look at why do companies work with us, it's really around how to identify those attackers in a network without delivering a huge amount of noise that we've seen from traditional tooling. And obviously what a lot of people are facing is that challenge of, how much information do I need to find the threats that I've got on our enterprise network?
So why are there so many large-scale breaches like Optus and Latitude Financial last year?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see. And I think we've seen this in the States, a number of years ago where we've seen, obviously big government customers as well as private enterprises that have had this issue. And I think it was just Australia's time. But if I look at, what happened and where it occurred, it's just one of those things that it seems to happen very quickly. Obviously, there was a lot in succession. You mentioned Optus and Latitude, and we've seen a couple of others even later this year. And I think the reality that we're looking at is the data that we're using and the understanding of that information is becoming more important to criminals. And they're using it more prolifically in their activities, whether it's, to try and gain financial means or cause harm. And I think this is just a reality of what we're facing at the moment.
The government wants to step in and help stop breaches, and banning ransomware payments has been proposed. Latitude Financial refused to pay. What's your view on that?
Yeah, honestly, for anyone that's in that situation, I'd hate to be there. We see companies that end up in a circumstance where they are ransomed, and having to make that decision as to whether you pay or not. I know a lot of them will go through a lot of determinations to figure it out. But if we look at the overall trends before we get to the government side of this, if I just look at the general trends in ransom payments, if we look through some of the research that we've seen, typically customers are not paying as much as what they previously had done. If we look at, I think there was one of the annual reports that came out that said, we had seen a decline in roughly about 38% in organizations paying a ransom. But also too, we've seen that even when companies have paid that ransom, they don't necessarily get all that information back, or that ability to decrypt is not as good as maybe it was tested by the attackers at the time. So I think the banning of the payment from a government stance is it's probably not going to be a big deterrent for attackers. I think where we need to get better at as an industry is understanding what we can do to stop a breach before it gets to that point of ransom, and really focusing in on those behavioral elements that we see and making sure that you can highlight to an organization very, very quickly what's going on, and that everyone's aware of these potential behaviors that we see from these attackers before they get to that point of ransom. I think that's really the key area where we can help. As they say, prevention is better than the cure.
You've described recent cyber attacks using the term unknown threat. What does this mean in ANZ and APAC?
Yeah, we actually did some research on this, and this was a really interesting stat that we got back. So from the research that we did, we'd seen that 7 out of 10 security leaders believed that they could already have an attacker inside their environment without knowing that. And that's really what we mean as the unknown. That seems like an awfully large number. And maybe CISOs, and rightly so, they are a little more on edge than the rest of a business when it comes to this. But I think it just highlights what we've seen in terms of blind spots, and blind spots that are caused by just way too much information being presented to a security team that are way overloaded. The other end of that research, we also asked the practitioners, how do they feel in terms of, do they have the adequate tools to combat these attackers? And it was 8 out of 10 felt that they were outgunned against modern attack groups in terms of the controls that they had available, and also the means that they had available to defend against this. And this is really what we looked at. And it doesn't really matter whether it's ANZ or APAC. It seems to be that we're facing the same adversaries. We have very, very similar challenges. Maybe there's some slight cultural differences, but in terms of the actual challenge that's being faced, it's very, very similar across the entire region.
That leads us into the next question really well, actually. So just how important is the role of AI within cybersecurity now?
Yeah, and this is something that we learned very, very early on. And I think there's a little bit of miscommunication / disinformation that comes out about AI in the industry. And we hear a lot from other vendors where they'll say that, AI can replace an individual. And that's not the purpose. Where we've found the role of AI is actually to help automate and to get rid of that mundane, low-level noise so that we can focus on the more critical tasks. And this is really where we've been implementing our AI toolset, is looking at that attacker behavior to highlight these challenges very, very early on, to say we can see something on your environment. And then we use AI to prioritize that, to tell an analyst, this is the most important thing that you need to look at right now so that you can protect your business. And if I look at, where our customers have really benefited from that, it's that picking up, the needle in a stack of needles. And that's where I see AI as being incredibly effective. If we look at it at a very targeted set of problems and we train it up for that, it becomes very, very efficient in what it's able to deliver. If we go really broad with it, it becomes very vague. And following those behaviors is really where we see that impact coming through AI.
ChatGPT is all in the news right now. So what are the security impacts of emerging tools like that?
Yeah, it's been a really hot topic. Obviously, as we talk internally and we talk to customers, it's something that we see a lot about. And I look at ChatGPT, I've seen some really, really interesting implementations and some questions that have been asked, and I've seen friends and family use it for some really interesting things. But if you look at from a cybersecurity lens, where I see this being potentially challenging, it's not necessarily that it's going to write malware for you, that some people have kind of indicated, but I think when it comes to, a reconnaissance that an attacker could do, it certainly gives them a speed and tool set. And we think about efficiency, that's what it's about. It's how can it quickly go out and find information to either help an attacker target, or it could be used for a defender to help identify what they're seeing on a behavioral pattern. So again, if we look at that view that we have, is really AI is there to make us more efficient and get rid of some of that manual mundane task. I see ChatGPT as being no different.
How important is changing government legislation in areas like privacy to stop cyber attacks and data breaches?
Yeah, I actually think it's really important. And the reason I think it's important, if I look at the way businesses tend to treat information and the way we as individuals look at information, I think it's a shared responsibility across an enterprise that every individual understands not only what is the information that I'm handling, but what's the impact of that. And the reason legislation is important is because it just helps bring that awareness to the individuals. Now, obviously, it's a punitive way of doing it, but I think we've done a lot of awareness. I think there's been a lot of training that's been done, but this is where we really need to get serious. If we have a look at just the impact that we've seen on Australians alone, I don't know how many text messages you're getting every day from supposedly your child that's lost their phone, or just other information that's coming through that's becoming way more targeted. I think it really does become that shared responsibility for every individual to understand what is the information that I'm processing or handling, and what are the potential impacts of that. And I think legislation goes a long way to help raise that awareness to the general population.
What advice would you offer security leaders as they face the unknown threat in the cybersecurity landscape?
Yeah, I really think this is something when I look at cybersecurity, it's not a one-off fire drill. And we tend to see a lot of exercises that will get done in a business. They do it once and they never check it again. Cybersecurity is one, it's a team sport. but also it's something that you have to practice. It's a muscle that you need to keep working on to make sure that when you do get an incident, and it's not a question of if, it's always a question of when now. When an incident occurs, that you're highly skilled in the drills that you've got to be able to execute on. So, if we see an attacker come into an environment, what are the playbooks? What are the things that we need to do to protect that business? And my advice would be to all businesses is firstly start with this understanding that whilst we do everything we can to prevent an attack, it's inevitable that it's going to happen. The next thing is then let's practice that, and let's regularly practice it. So let's run those exercises in our environments and make sure that the tooling that we have is able to cope with it. Make sure that our policy and procedures are able to deal with that effectively. And if there's gaps, that's okay. Let's go and fix them and understand how to remediate them. And I think this is really, an approach that we've seen work incredibly well in our customer base. I've seen it, more broadly across some other industries where they take this mentality that it's not if, it's when. And let's go test the when and test it regularly and see how well we stack up against, an adversary inside our environment and how quickly we can remove them. And ultimately, when we look at breaches, and you can see it in any of the data that's come from a breach, the longer the attack is active in the environment, the more impact that has in terms of dollars to that business.
That's all great. So how can potential partners work with you? Do you do direct sales, channel, MSPs? How?
Yeah, so we obviously we have a 100% channel model, but we're all available if anyone wants to come and understand from Vectra a little bit more around what we do and how we can help their business. We're more than happy to come and talk directly to customers, but we do work through our channel partners. We have a number of channel partners across Asia Pacific and Japan, and we're open to working with anyone who really is looking for good outcomes for their customers.
And is there anything else you'd like to add while we're here?
Yeah, look, I appreciate obviously the time to get to do this. And one of the big things that we've seen growing, and it's an area of concern for us, and we're starting to see this more and more through some of our services, is just the exposure that we see when moving from traditional on-premise into those hybrid networks, specifically when we look at things like AWS and Microsoft Azure. There's a whole component layer in there that we call a control plane. And this is an area that we're starting to see more and more attackers looking into because it's, one, not very well understood, but two, it's the same for every customer. If we think of an attacker that's coming in, and obviously we've seen in the news about this snake malware, that's this very sophisticated toolkit that supposedly a nation states had access to, and that gives them this great ability to pivot through a network. But if I look at an AWS or an Azure, the infrastructure is the same customer to customer. I don't have to do a lot of reconnaissance because I know your data is sitting in an S3 bucket. I know a lot of your functions will be sitting in other parts within AWS. So this gives an attacker a really big leg up, or an ability to accelerate their attacks and their timeframes of their attacks, and reduce the number of steps that they need to identify, or reduce the number of steps that they need to take in order to be able to get to their objective. And this is an area where we've done a lot of research into it. And we've got a number of papers that we have around some of the research that we've done into this area. And I think it's something that we as practitioners need to get better at understanding. But I also think it's something that we need to take very, very seriously, because this is where we could see things like supply chain becoming a very, very big problem if they're pivoting from one customer into another.
Well, thank you very much, Chris Fisher.
Thank you very much, Nick.